recordings in the end. I don't know. But let me pull up the slides. And this is to make sense of the dialectic, the theory of recognition, in the direction of unpacking this relational view of self, but also to give a broader overview of Hegel's metaphysical system. Okay. So let's make some further sense of dialectic, what it means in the Hegelian capacity, or sense, I should say. So it's a metaphysical system of logic. That is to say, since metaphysics is the philosophical investigation into the nature of being or reality, this kind of logic is a logic of being, a logic of reality. So how reality works, how as a totality or a whole, it is mutually articulated through its parts. So this logic, as we're understanding it, consists of a dynamic structure of opposition that's comparable to what I described in terms of the ancient pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus, the one who advanced this theory of multiplicity, or excuse me, of unity in multiplicity, using the example of a river. So you can't step into the same river twice, on the one hand, because the very contents of that river are constantly changing. But of course, you can step into the same river twice, because the very fact that those contents are constantly changing, that is, the fact of the multiplicity of the river, is a necessary condition for the very unity by which we recognize the river as a river. So it's only because of the dynamic opposition between the present contents of the water and its flow and that with which it'll be replaced that we can even identify it and recognize it conceptually as a river. And so this is a developmental unity. So developmental suggesting that there are stages or parts, but they are all cohering within a kind of evolutionary whole. And so this evolutionary whole is articulated through stages of tension, conflict, in other words, opposition or multiplicity, where what is at first just abstract, incomplete, and merely potential becomes concrete, complete, and actual. So it moves from levels of abstraction towards concrete specificity. And so things, just in general, anything you might consider, any phenomenon, so that which exists or that which is what it is, partially in virtue of what it is not. So things are what they are in virtue of what they are not. And so this is what is meant by negation. That is in connection to some other. And so this is taken from Hegel's Science of Logic. And consider this structure. So we begin with indeterminate being. So we're just thinking about the nature of reality, of what is, quite generally, with no assumptions, no presuppositions, no ideological kind of attunement or expectation. So we start with indeterminate being. And that's what Hegel means by immediacy. So you're just saying there is being. You're saying there is. But notice at this point, in order to say that there is being, there has to be not being. Otherwise, there is just this sort of undifferentiated universal extension of presence, right? There isn't a being, there is just being, right? So in order to get away from that, which is just pure immediacy, there's just being, to get to the specificity of there being existent entities, you need to think of non-being. So for example, if I just say this coffee cup is, I can't understand its being as a coffee cup until I recognize that which it is not. So when I say this is a coffee cup and the coffee cup is in my hand, I'm saying that my hand is not the coffee cup, that my coffee cup is not the hand. And in the relation of being to non-being, so the being of the coffee cup negates the being of my hand, meaning that it's different than my hand, allows me to say there is a coffee cup and there is a hand, right? So to be able to say what something is, you have to be able to say what it is not, because it's only then that you can get to the limits of a thing. If there are no limits that define and delimit the presence of a given phenomenon from that by which it's surrounded, well, then you can't identify or recognize it as the phenomenon that it is. So you start with indeterminate being, just pure being, and it's abstract at this point, because you're not talking about this or that being, just beings. But to get from abstraction to something concrete, you want to talk about this thing and not just being in general, you need non-being. So indeterminate being in its immediacy gives way to non-being, and now you get a determinate being. So this coffee cup, this pen, my body, the tree outside my window, the office in which I'm currently sitting, these are determinate beings, which are articulated in their presence, allowing me to recognize them partially in virtue of what they are not. So I can only say I am in this office, my office, if I understand that it's limited by the other offices by which it's surrounded, or in fact, the outer limits or external contours of the building in which it's situated. So something, so this coffee cup and then the other to the coffee cup, my hand, or this office and the other to this office, the neighboring office. But now when it comes to determinate being, we are brought to consider the process of becoming. So since I note that this coffee cup is a being, and I come to recognize it as what it is, partially in virtue of what it's not, I recognize that it's finite. In other words, there are limits to this being. And those limits are spatial, as I've already recognized. This coffee cup doesn't consume all of reality. It's locatable within a particular place and within a particular context of relations with that by which it's around. But also temporally, I come to find that this coffee cup is not eternal. It was created at a particular point. It will eventually decay and dissolve itself and disappear from reality, right? So whenever we talk about determinate being, so this or that entity, we have to talk about the process of becoming. And when we talk about becoming, we talk about either coming to be, so generation, coming into existence, birth, creation, or ceasing to be, decay, dissolution, death, disappearance. And that means finitude, right? So being limited in time and space. But when I think of finitude, when I think of such limits, I think about the broader sphere in which I come to presence as limited. So I think of my parents and their parents and their parents and their parents ad infinitum, back into the farthest, most obscure reaches of history, right? I think about the beginning of the cosmos, right? I think about the indeterminate future towards which we are all oriented in ways that will be radically surprising and destabilizing for us. So that means I'm thinking of myself as a limited, finite being within the context of an infinitude or an infinity, right? And so this is what Hegel means by spirit. So I find myself as an I within the broader cultural and historical arc or developmental structure of a we, which exceeds me in time and space. So there is a we that exists as a foundation before I can come into existence, and there is a we as our broader cultural character or personality that will remain in place once I'm gone, right? So this is spirit. And so here I'm talking about infinity, in other words, being again, pure being. So notice what happens. I'm back right at the beginning. We've traveled along through this logic, a kind of circle, except the being at which we arrive at the end, also indeterminate being, because I'm just talking about being as such. In other words, being in general, not this hamster or this grain of sand or this almond or this neutron star or this piece of dust, or this sandwich, or whatever else. I'm talking about being in general. But notice there's a difference. We're no longer talking about indeterminate being in its pure immediacy, because we've traveled now through all these developmental stages of the evolution of spirit. Now we arrive back at indeterminate being, but one that has been mediated through the necessary terms of the overarching process itself. So we arrive at precisely the place where we began, but it's a return to the beginning in which we are transformed. Our sense of being is transformed because it's now been mediated and it's not abstract. In other words, it's concrete. So this is the essential logic of the dialectic. And so really we're going to talk about how that logic unfolds with respect to individual consciousnesses and the very possibility of achieving self-consciousness, that is giving expression to this sense of I-ness within the broader nurturing field as a kind of originary source of a we or of a collective identity. So does this make some kind of sense? I know this is complicated, but hopefully this makes some sense.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's like a way of saying that, like, to say that we exist, we have to like be able to compare ourselves to others so we can like distinguish what we are and what we're not.
Yeah, in fact, the very consciousness by which you, through language and other capacities that make possible whatever it is that you can do as a sort of being that you are, as the human consciousness that you are, that is all necessarily grounded in a sort of intersubjective, that is to say, your subjectivity, your I-ness, if we use this sort of Cartesian framework, necessarily points to or presupposes a broader field of we-ness, of us-ness, if you will, in which you can come to find yourself as a self at all. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
And so to continue, there's some important vocabulary to make sense of for Hegel. So he talks about being in itself, first of all, versus being for itself. So as a body, and as body, I am comparable to the presence of this coffee cup, or the chair in which I'm sitting, or the building in which I find myself. At this level, we're just talking about material presence. So comparable to all those things, as a body in space and time, I am a being in itself. I am a thing. That is, I am pure static, so not needing really to evolve along a particular pathway of determinacy. So I am just a body, I am just materiality. And in that way, I have pure self-coincidence. That is to say, if I just consider myself as a body, it would be the same as considering this coffee cup. So this coffee cup achieves perfect self-coincidence. That is, it doesn't dream of one day writing romantic novels. It doesn't desire to return to the earth. It doesn't wish it was a different color, for example. It doesn't experience dissatisfaction with itself. It simply is, right? So that's what I mean by being in itself. It's immediate, positive presence, and it's abstractly considered as separate from other things. Then there's being for itself. Insofar as I am consciousness, I am being for itself. And as consciousness, I can relate to my own body in different ways. And so I can reflect on my body, for example, either negatively or positively. And so a being for itself has consciousness, and in that way it has self-consciousness. In other words, it's self-comprehending. And so if you understand yourself, and this is a really unique sort of relation, self-understanding. If you understand yourself, then you are not like the coffee cup is, or your body considered alone by itself, perfectly immediate or positive, right? So we're not using positive and negative here in the moral sense, like good and bad. Positive meaning full of presence. There's no absence. There's no negativity or negation. But when it comes to self-consciousness, self-relationship, to relate to myself, there has to be some absence. There has to be some negativity. There has to be some distance between the self of which I am conscious, say in the presence of my body, and the act of consciousness itself. And so that's why, in terms of who we are as consciousness and bodies, we can be dissatisfied with ourselves. So we can wish that we had different bodies. We can be unhappy with our bodies. And that means, in terms of our self-relationship, there is a gap between consciousness and that of which the consciousness is conscious, the body itself. And being for itself at the first most sort of incipient abstract level of development is really just pure undifferentiated desire, right? So that's what consciousness is at the first level. So I desire fulfillment. I desire to ultimately bridge the gap that separates my natural body from the consciousness that it is aware of it. And so I'm not purely my body, according to Hegel. And that's because, I mean, if you think of different examples, like those who participate now, this happens to this day for activism, for important social opposition. Think about hunger strikes. So your body desires food, for example, to keep itself going, but your consciousness can, for a particular purpose that it cares about, can deny that. Can say, no, you're not going to feed yourself. I am willing to starve. I am willing to allow my body to disappear from reality, which will ultimately mean my very consciousness will disappear from reality because I hold some goal higher than my own continuation, my own perdurance in the world. And then there's being for other. So this is self-denying in recognition of an other's power. So if you are, say, dominated, if you are enslaved, and you are brought to recognize the other as a legitimate authority who possesses or exerts control over you, well, then you take on the consciousness of being for other, right? You reduce the very significance of your being to that which matters to the other who is more important. And then there's the combination of being in itself and being for itself. Now, on the one hand, when we talk about being in and for itself, we're talking about the absolute all-comprehending spirit. So at the highest stage of this historical evolution, and that is the I that is a we and the we that is an I. So that is Geist, in which consciousness overcomes or fulfills itself by supplanting or overcoming the separation between itself and the hard resistance of material physical nature. And so traditionally, Hegel understands the only possible being that can, in a perfect, satisfying way, achieve being in and for itself as God. But in a different manner, human beings are also being in for itself, but in a way that isn't resolved, in a way that doesn't achieve perfect self-coincidence. So that's why I can be dissatisfied with my body or worry about my body's aging in time and so forth. Okay. And then another important thing here, these are the mechanics, and we talked about the mechanics at the beginning of these slides in the context of the essential metaphysical logic at play in Hegel's approach. But now we're really naming the three elements that constitute the dialectic as such, as again, a sort of overarching metaphysical and historical process. So there is the thesis. So every dialectical process or movement involves these three elements. There is the thesis, in which there's one or more concepts or objects are fixed, defined, and distinct. So that was looking at the essential logic from the beginning, pure immediacy or indeterminate being. But that can't last. So at some point, to come to recognize individual things, remember, you have to make space for negativity or non-being. So that would be the antithesis. So you have being, and then you have that which contests the being or qualifies the being. So through reflection, a contradiction or contradictions emerge. So this is what Hegel labels dialectical reason. So some opposition comes up in response to the thesis. And the third term is the synthesis, and the German word is Aufhebung. And so aufheben is the verb, and it's sometimes translated as synthesis, sometimes as sublation, or sometimes as canceling, right? So the synthesis, this third term, cancels the antithesis, which for its part opposed the thesis. So the Aufhebung, the synthesis, is a higher concept that encompasses the earlier ones, so the thesis and the antithesis, and through that encompassing ends up resolving the contradiction or the tension, but while still preserving the essential role that each of these earlier moves or moments contributed to the process itself. And so this is concrete mediacy, since the earlier terms that made up the beginning of the process are mediated, whereas the thesis is simply abstract immediacy. There is being, there is this coffee cup, or whatever particular being you want to talk about. Okay, now we can get to the struggle to the death, right? To make sense of how this master-slave relationship unfolds. So put yourself again in this abstract, as Hegel understands it, this unsatisfyingly abstract Cartesian starting point. So you are one self-consciousness, a little Cartesian ego, a little insulated bubble of awareness that is somehow alongside the world. Well, now you encounter another Cartesian ego that, like in the video, looks at you. And you're like, what are you? You seem to be like me. Are you looking at me? So you're seeing a body before you, but that body, through its gestures, through its manifestation, suggests something more than body. You're not just looking at a car or a rock or a tree. You're looking at the physical manifestation of a kind of consciousness which is capable of self-consciousness, just like you. So again, we're dealing with a sort of abstract scenario, because you're imagining that you are, say, this primitive being that has in some measure self-consciousness, but you've never encountered an other, right? So you're purely alone, but you see this other and you think, wait, as consciousness, my consciousness extends from the very physical locus of my bodily presence in the world, right here where I am, to literally as far as I can apprehend through my senses, right? And so I can look 100 yards away, and if I'm hungry, so my body is showing itself in the expression of desire, I want food, I want sustenance, I can see an apple tree. And my consciousness, perceiving that apple tree 100 yards away, encompasses that apple tree. It ends up almost possessing it. I say, that is mine. That tree, that being in itself, that physical object exists for me. And I can go over there and take it. But now you see another person standing between you in that tree 100 yards away. And you think, wait, what the fuck is going on? I am everything. My consciousness consumes the entire world. Who are you? How dare you exist? But for the other's part, also a consciousness too, they reply, no, I'm everything. Because they have the same sort of position of self-understanding within the world in which they find themselves, right? So they say, I am everything. How dare you exist? So now you have these two consciousnesses which appear as a limit of the other, as a checking of the other. So Hegel says at this point, again, we're at a really abstract stage. There are only three possible outcomes, three possible ways that this can proceed at this moment. The one can kill the other. So let's say one goes over there and bashes the guy's head in, and now can say, all right, the tree is mine. The fruits of the tree are mine. But here's a contradiction. Now, because there's something about the appearance of that other consciousness which confirmed your very power, right? That says, you are not me, I am not you. And in that distinction, which requires recognition, you are recognizing the power of the other, and the other is recognizing the power of you as a sort of source of oppositional consciousness at this point. So now I don't have anyone to affirm my power. And I've ended the body. So if I end up killing this person to get the apple tree, I have ended their body, but it wasn't really their body that resisted me. It wasn't as if there's just some physical impediment that blocked my path that I could just strategize by climbing over or avoiding in some way. It's not really your body that's opposing me. It's your consciousness that's opposing me. Your consciousness is saying, no, that's my tree. The fruits of that tree are for me, not for you. But when I smash your body, I haven't really smashed your consciousness, right? And why is that? Because as we've already said, our consciousness is not reducible to our bodies at any moment. So you might say, I don't give a fuck about my body. And that's what people do, for example, when they're willing to die for a cause, right? Whether it's through a hunger strike or putting their bodies in danger through protest movements or whatever else. You can say, yeah, I am my body in some sense. Hegel's not a dualist like Descartes, but I am not only my body. In fact, there's a separation between my consciousness and my body such that I'm willing at certain points to sacrifice my body for something I take to be more important. So if that person is willing to sacrifice their body, they're like, fine, let's go, let's fight. And you beat them, well, you've only beaten their body. And in some way, their consciousness will continue to haunt you, right? Because they never relented. They never consented. They never said, okay, you're right. You're more important than I am. I will subordinate my will to your will. So that's the contradiction that first appears. So you'll see the dead body and you'll think, well, I mean, it's fine, I guess. I can get the apples that I wanted, but I wish I could have made him agree that he is nothing and I am everything. So that's one possibility. And the second one is one surrenders, like I just said. So you could say, all right, so you might think, yeah, I am not reducible to my body. My consciousness as will can exceed the demands of my bodily constitution, can make sacrifices in that direction, but I don't think this particular battle is worth it, you might say, because I understand that although my consciousness is not reducible to my body, I kind of need my body in order to remain an active consciousness. So let's say, all right, okay, I'm not willing to fight. If you're that crazy about the tree, fine. I consent. But let's say consciousness one doesn't agree to the terms of the consent. They're not happy with it. They kill you anyway. But now we're back in the contradiction that emerges from the first outcome. Then the third possibility is the one surrenders. The one says, okay, I don't want to fight. I don't want to die. I'm willing to sacrifice something, to give up a little bit of my will in order to live another day. And then the other consents. So here's where the master-slave situation begins. And so Herr is the word in German for like Sir in English, or Mr. So it's like the master, the authority. And then Knecht is like the one who is a servant. So it doesn't necessarily have to translate to slave, but it's the kind of boss and servant relationship. So does this make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. So I have a question sort of. So say like I guess situation one happens and consciousness one kills the body of consciousness two. But I guess consciousness two is like still there, just not their body. Wouldn't that still kind of like affirm consciousness one?
Uh,
Or
yeah, you might. So yeah, that's a good point. You might get some satisfaction at first. So you might think, yeah, I won. I defeated this person. But then you're alone again. And you got a little bit of a taste of, of the value and significance, and perhaps even you might say nurturing effect of your ability to dominate another, to control another, to serve you. But that has been eliminated, right? So you kind of wish that there was the other person that you could now, instead of bashing their head in, you could say, go pick those apples for me, right? And when you tell them, go pick those apples for me, go fix me dinner, their consent, their agreement to that, their following your commands actually mirrors back your importance, your significance. It affirms your very existence as not only a kind of positive existence, but a kind of dominating, authoritative, overarchingly significant bodily importance. And that is to say, your consciousness as exerting a constant threat over the other's very being, over their very life, affirms your value in a way that isn't possible without another consciousness. Does that make sense?
yeah, yeah, okay.
Okay. So now here we get to the master-slave dialectic. We're almost out of time, but we can continue this next time. So consciousness one says, I will dominate you. Your existence is for me. So through this oppressive kind of attitude, through this oppressive, repressive, controlling comportment, consciousness one reduces the very being of consciousness two to being for other. You're basically expressing through violence or the threat of violence that that other exists purely for you, purely to serve your own consciousness. And so consciousness one, the master, now exerts immediate control over the slave's body. Immediate control. You want the slave to do something, they're not doing it, you kick them or beat them, or grab them and put them somewhere. You exert immediate control over their body, and thus mediate, so not immediate control. You can't put your hands or even your own thinking, as it were, into the head of the other and exert some sort of immediate mind control, right? But through the threat of violence, however you might exert that threat, you are able to practice and enjoy a mediated control over the slave's consciousness. So if you say, if you don't do what I want, I am going to whip you, right? Or I'm going to beat the crap out of you. And that is how you, in a mediated way, control their consciousness, because they don't want to undergo that suffering or violence. So then they'll carry out your will. And by carrying out your will, the enslaved person is going to do the work I just mentioned. For example, picking the apples from the tree, or going out and killing a chicken for the master's dinner. And so through this mediation of the slaves or the enslaved person's consciousness, the master, consciousness one, actually controls external nature. So the apple tree or the animals that you would compel through the threat of violence the slave to kill and to prepare for you. And so I don't have to immediately control external nature to satisfy my desires. Because remember, for Hegel here, consciousness is essentially desire, the opening or coming to presence of desire or will. So I don't have to control external nature to satisfy my desires, because I can do that in a mediated way by controlling you, the enslaved person. But then these contradictions come up. So this is the last thing I'll say. Why are there contradictions? There are contradictions for the master and the slave. And so if you recall the logic, here's the antithesis, where some kind of change is necessary because these starting conditions are not sustainable. They're not satisfying. So contradictions for the master. My worth as the master depends on the slave's recognition. So I am the master only because there's someone I have made a slave and compelled through the threat of violence to say, you're the master, you're the boss. So my very identity as an authority depends upon the recognition of the other. But since I've enslaved that other, I've already decided that the person is not worth a damn, that they're insignificant. Their existence is just for me. So if I consider what their existence means by itself, in itself, it is entirely negative. But I'm relying on the recognition of this person for my own value. But I've already said this person is nothing. So how valuable can that recognition in the end be? It's not very satisfying. Next, the other contradiction, my independence is secured by my dependence on the slaves working on external nature. And for this reason, I become alienated from the world. I no longer know how to do things like kill an elk or something for dinner because I'm dependent upon the slave to do that for me. And so then paradoxically, my independence is dependent on the very being of the slave. And this is a kind of contradiction, right? So we're out of time, but we'll pick this up next time and talk about the contradictions for the slave in this master-slave relationship. But did that help understand what's going on here?
When you talk about conscious one and conscious two, are you talking about like two different people, or is it just like the same person thinking about two different things?
No, it's two different people.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, two different people.
Okay.
So the idea here is true, healthy, productive, happy self-consciousness relies upon the ability to recognize others equally, right? That these unequal situations between individuals, such as the inequality you find between masters and slaves, is not sustainable. It will ultimately give way to violence, where the slave will demand recognition and overcome the master, or more happily, there will be some social conditions of equal recognition where no one is taken to be superior to the others. Right? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so we'll take some more time to work through this on Thursday. And then the short story that I assigned by Ursula K. Le Guin, it talks about human cloning. It's like a sci-fi story. It's very interesting. But I think she gets at the way in which self-consciousness for its pursuit of happiness and health, of ontological security, as Lang puts it in the Resson article, relies on the consciousness of others. And so, yeah, we'll talk about that short story, but okay. All right, guys, I'll see you on Thursday.
All right. Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.